Jonathan Rowe is the Program Manager for South Dunedin Future, a joint initiative between the Dunedin City Council and the Otago Regional Council to develop a climate change adaptation plan for the low-lying and flood-affected South Dunedin region. Many of you, if you've been to this, will have seen papers on that. Jonathan's background is in sustainable development. Prior to joining Council, is 15 years working in central government, primarily for MFAT and the NZ Aid program, and has also had roles advising the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Climate Change. A round of applause as we welcome Jonathan Rowe. Kia ora, Jonathan. Green means go.
Okay, fabulous. Thanks so much. Kia ora, folks. Good morning. As per the intro, my name is Jonathan Rowe. So I'm based at the Dunedin City Council, but actually in a joint role that's funded by both the Regional Council and City Council. So I wear both hats, take them off and on as and when pleases, and that kind of speaks to a little bit of the nature of the role, where I'm neither a planner nor an engineer nor a policy person. I just sort of basically have a mandate to meddle in all of those areas. And if you think about my role working horizontally across councils, I'm kind of like an MC that tries to connect a whole bunch of stuff, including on South Dunedin. So if I flick that, so South Dunedin, a fabulous part of what is a wonderful city, and a place that aspires to be one of the great small cities in the world. So Dunedin, so that's a shot there. You're basically looking at a drone shot from over the harbour. You've got South D in the foreground there, wedged between essentially the harbour, the Southern Ocean and the surrounding hill suburbs. So there's not a whole lot between that South Coast and Antarctica, which is one of the reasons why we get some fairly gnarly weather. For those that aren't super familiar with Dunedin or South Dunedin, so Dunedin is there in the lower South Island, and South Dunedin is essentially that small piece of land that joins the peninsula with the mainland. Formed, I think, about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, alluvial sediments washing up the coast, and essentially you've got this flat, fabulous area right there. So, quick history lesson. Hasn't always looked like that. Surprise, surprise. So, prior to European settlement, local Māori used it as a mahinga kai, so food gathering area, transport through to the Tairi Plains, which is another flood-affected area, which we can be the topic of another conversation. And when Dunedin was settled by the Europeans, big demand for flat land, and obviously big push out to, in the top right of that first photo on the left there, you can see this super flat area that, if you jump forward into the middle picture, 100 years on, you could see basically the modern urban form is really established on that low-lying area, and there's a big process of land reclamation going on in the 60s and 70s, and then you have sort of modern-day South Dunedin in that bottom right. Why we talk a little bit about history is that this is an environment that's been enormously modified, right? So on the left-hand image there, you can see essentially an overlay of that previous geography on top of what is the current sort of urban form. Former coastal wetland, the key being, there used to be a lot more water in South Dunedin. You had streams that aren't actually marked on that map, but that flowed out of the Glen and St Clair, emptied into a lagoon, emptied into the harbour where we currently have Mitre 10 Mega. That speaks to how much it's been modified. And over that last 100 years, a lot of kind of mining of the dunes, reclamation, uplift, reefing of certain areas. And that's where you get the geography on the right. So this is a LiDAR shot of modern day South D. The dark blue there is below sea level at present day. And obviously a lot of that blue areas, that former coastal marshy wetland, that's very, very flat. I think a drop of about a metre, half a metre. The other kind of key feature of that is the green land on the harbour edge. This is the reclaimed land from the 60s and 70s. And why that's important is that it's 1.5 metres or 2 metres higher than the flat. So what we've done is effectively created a basin. So there's now no natural outflow for water in South Dunedin. So if you think about any water that hits the hills, falls in that catchment, it has to, goes down, it has to get out of there. It's a gravity-fed system, but any water that goes in there effectively has to be pumped out, and that's at present day. I'm conscious, I said I'm not an engineer, and I'm speaking to a room probably full, or half full at least, of engineers. This is a little map of the stormwater network and the wastewater network. So South Dunedin, for its sins, also is the location or the point where a lot of South Dunedin's, all of Dunedin's stormwater and wastewater is redirected. Obviously bottom of the catchment, but it deals with a lot of water issues from the wider city. Normally that's fine, 99.9% of the time you've got a system that can deal with it. Every now and then it doesn't. So essentially, if you think about South Dunedin being a bathtub, when you've got more water coming in the top and going out the bottom, it fills up. There's a history of flooding going back to the 20s, and some really interesting characteristics of the 20s and 30s that I'll talk about later in the presentation. But we had a really big event in 2015, some of you may be familiar with. That was the genesis for this program, South Dunedin Future, the one that I work on. And then we had another little reminder last year, another flood event in October. Not as bad, slightly different sort of characteristics of the storm. And we'd learnt a lot of lessons from 2015 that were deployed and made an impact which was positive, but nonetheless a reminder of what we're in for. The bad news, we're going to get more water. So latest science around sea level rises, we're expecting somewhere between sort of 50 and 80 centimetres of sea level rise by the end of the century, 75 years' time. So if you think about that in the context of that LiDAR shot I showed you before, whack another 50 or 80 centimetres on top of that, the balance of South Dunedin's flat area will be below a mean average sea level. So basically below sea level half of the day. One, that's important because you've got to get water up and out, but also that sea level rise puts enormous sort of lateral pressure on groundwater as well, and there's some fabulous work from our friends and colleagues at GNS Science who've looked at what that impact might be on groundwater. Really shallow groundwater in South Dunedin today, so if you could go and knock on a door in South Dunedin, ask if you can go into their backyard. If they let you, you could dig a hole, go inside, have a cup of coffee, and go back outside. And if you've dug down 50 centimetres, there'll likely be water in the bottom of the hole. Come back next afternoon, it might be as high as 20, 30 centimetres, depending on where the water is at the water table is at the time. So as we get sea level rise, that's going to rise as well. So you're looking at sort of late century, a lot of South Dunedin, the majority of South Dunedin, you might have groundwater pooling at surface level. So essentially saturated land with all of the implications that that has for underground infrastructure, horizontal infrastructure, buildings, people, most importantly, that live there. I see probably a lot of engineers rubbing their hands thinking this is great work and problems we can solve. So basically what South Dunedin Future is about is looking at how do we tackle these challenges. And one of the quotes I thought I'd share today is from a colleague who's a water engineer, formerly worked on this program, and he said that a lot of the sort of stormwater, the technical solutions to these problems have been known for some time. The technology exists to manage all of this, right? We could get all that water out, we could build lots of pumps and pipes and water suppression systems and dikes and whatever. The question is more about should we, and what are the trade-offs involved in taking a particular pathway versus others. And that's really what this program's about, is being a vehicle for having that discussion with policymakers, with planners, with the community, and ultimately with decision makers and funders. So some of that program, South Dunedin Future, involves a partnership. So as I said, the two councils, the local Runaka and the South D community are kind of these core partners that are involved very closely. But there's an enormous amount of sort of technical policy complexity to this. So we have a range of technical partners that assist, and the regional council with their sort of mandate in the space leads on that. We have a fabulous university down in Dunedin. Dunedin's kind of this weird little city where it's about 130,000 people, maybe a fifth of those are either at lectures or drunk. But that entity that is either at lectures or drunk or delivering the lectures also has enormous brain power, right? So we have a lot of access to research, ideas, development, and because Dunedin operates in this kind of Goldilocks zone where it's big enough that it's got this critical mass of knowledge and ideas and capability, but small enough that you either know everyone you need to talk to, or you can get them all in the same room at the same time. I imagine trying to do this sort of challenge in, say, Auckland might be enormously challenging or more difficult than in Dunedin. So I think we're in this kind of Goldilocks zone where maybe we're better set up to address it. We also obviously have a range of commercial partners that we need their knowledge, their capability, their scale to be able to tackle these things. And our kind of key partners there, WSP, Tonkin and Taylor and Becker, that are helping us do a lot of the technical work, Jacobs, who are peer reviewing it, and PwC, who are looking at some of the commercial elements of it. So that's kind of probably the inner two layers of the onion, if you like. And then there's a range of other layers outside of that. So it's really big, becoming a really big beast. That is the program. So it's a big, complex beast, 5 years, but it's summarised in that ribbon. And there's anyone that's familiar with dynamic adaptive planning pathways, or DAP approach, might recognise that as an unrolled DAP wheel. Essentially, in summary, we want to understand how the environment's changing, get a sense of how does that impact on things that matter to us, so people, places, assets, and then work out, okay, now that we've defined the problem or we've gone to the doctor and we've got a diagnosis, what can we do about that? So what are all their treatment options, whether that's massage therapy or surgery or whatever. And in a climate adaptation sense, we've got the spectrum of fight and flight. We can fight the water, we can manage it, we can build pumps, pipes, seawalls. We can maybe recreate some of those environments that might have used to be there. We create spaces where water can go, parks, wetlands, water detention basins, streams, daylighting, all of these sorts of things. Or we could just move people out of harm's way. We don't need to be there. And what are the options for doing that, and what does that look like? And then stepping back and saying, what are the trade-offs across all of these things, and how do you get the best mix? So very recently, we released a risk assessment report, which is basically adding those two macrons together and kind of saying, here's all the latest science, but also answering that so what question. What does this mean? And I'll talk a little bit about what that found. That was really nerve-wracking. It was that kind of lines on maps stage for us. There's a lot of talk in local government space about the Kapiti Coast example, where they tried to put hazard lines and erosion lines on maps and ended up in court, for the thick end of a decade. We've had a remarkably muted response to this, which is really interesting. We're just starting to unpick why that might be. Low-lying flood issues in South Dunedin aren't a new thing, so there is a very wide anecdotal knowledge and understanding of that. There's some evidence to suggest that there's a discount in the housing market that reflects that flood risk. So in some sense, it might just be that we've kind of quantified a problem that people already knew was there. But I can talk a little bit about that as well. The second thing we've released very recently is, and it's got more of a reaction, is basically an illustration of what could we do in the future. What could the future of South Dunedin look like if we took these different pathways down flight, or somewhere down the middle, and what are the pros and cons and costs associated with doing that, which I can talk about. So just a really quick summary, what did the risk assessment say? Surprise, surprise, South Dunedin is subject to lots of hazards. There's a list of the 6 hazards up the top of the images there. The Cheats version is blue is bad, and when you get lots more blue, it's sort of worse. So you can very clearly see that South Dunedin is a multi-hazard environment already, and that trajectory over time is for increasing exposure to hazards. By the end of the century there, you can see that you've got these compounding hazards of sea level rise in the form of coastal inundation, you've got high groundwater, and you've got pluvial flood risk as well. There's an underlying liquefaction risk and more isolated coastal erosion, slip and whatnot. So pretty gnarly space. That hazard assessment almost directly translates to risk. So if I rock and roll back and forth a little bit, like they do at the cricket sometimes, you get a feel for how closely that's correlated. And this is a bit of a proxy for what that risk profile looks like. So basically, how many of those hazards that we listed in the previous slide are generating medium or high risk to those features? And again, you see the trajectory. We also drilled down to quite a detailed layer, so looked at actually what's the risk to individual buildings and then aggregated that up. The catch being, obviously this gets super sensitive, politically, socially, economically, when you're drilling down to that level of detail. So for the report, we aggregated that back up to these kind of city block, SA1, statistical area 1 areas that Stats uses for a census. but nonetheless started to give people a feel for what does that risk trajectory look like, and how does that change over time in different parts of South Dunedin. This is quite a difficult spot, right, because there's winners and losers in these images. So starting to understand where our development of technical knowledge and understanding the space and the risk assessment has, I guess, addressed an uncertainty that may be sitting there for a lot of stakeholders to date. And now it's pushed us into this new space where now the uncertainty is around, what does that mean? What do we do about it? Is someone coming to buy my house if I'm high risk? Is it not? Is my capital gain going to tail off and go to zero? So we're into this very different set of challenges that we're looking at. The traditional risk assessment work was also mirrored with a mana whenua risk assessment. So we partnered with the Otako Runaka down in Dunedin, which is the local runaka. So they have worked with Dunedin City Council over recent years to develop a Māori strategic framework, and it was the views, values and aspirations in that framework that they used, supported by Tonkin and Taylor and others, to develop their own essential risk assessment methodology through a Te Ao Māori lens. And, you know, like all of New Zealand society, we're sitting there thinking, how do these two worlds fit together? How do you make them talk, and what does that mean? And, I mean, the fortunate thing you can see is that the assessment that the runaka came up with is very similar and reflects very similar risks to the more traditional assessment. And as we move forward, we're drawing all of this into a sort of consolidated framework for assessing, you know, what does good look like, and how do we manage these risks, and how do we address these values? But it's a big evolving piece of work. So that's the bad news, or the problem. The response to that was outlined in these 7 potential futures. So basically what we wanted to say was there are an enormous range of things that we can do to manage risk in South Dunedin, to manage the water, manage flood risk. There are innumerable options for that, but we are going to work with our technical partners and put them into different packages that, you know, collective knowledge and expertise and consultation to date says is kind of your best bang for buck, or this is what it could look like. What was really interesting about this analysis is that the status quo option came out as delivering the worst overall outcomes. So basically, if we keep doing what we are doing, it will give us, you know, some very high costs relative to any benefits. Basically, the place gets wet. So you get gradual rising of all the water, you get more and more frequent flood events, you get more and more losses, you get a gradual decrease in the value of property, you get pullback of investment and insurance, and you end up in basically a state of sort of urban decline or decay. So that's kind of the trajectory we're on. The other 6 options, I won't go into the details, but basically the easiest way to think about them and categorise them is options 2 and 3 basically take an engineering-heavy approach with the idea of keep the water out. So largely keep the urban form the way it is and keep the water out of South Dunedin, or if it gets in, get it out as quickly as we can. Options 4 and 5 use a mixed approach, so basically some sort of balance of infrastructure, nature-based solutions and managed retreat, and you kind of dial that up and down as you go. And options 6 and 7 predominantly involve a retreat focus. So let's just move people gradually, people and assets out of harm's way. You know, a significant part of South Dunedin, largely that flat area is going to be below sea level in 50, 60 years. So we are literally fighting a rising tide. So we also ran through a whole range of costs and benefits of this. While this is an enormously technical process and there's no limit to sort of what factors you can analyse, where it basically comes back to is a conversation about trade-offs. So one, how much change are we up for and at what rate? What's affordable, and that's obviously subjective. And also, you know, what level of risk are we ultimately willing to live with at the end of the day, if we can't manage or buy our way out of all of it. So this dashboard illustrates some of that. Pretty high-level costs at this stage. Obviously, you're making a few assumptions when you're thinking about a whole suburb over 75 years' time. But at the same time, starting to get a sense of, you know, the number of properties that might be affected, just how hard it might be to deliver, and what are you left with at the end? What have you managed your way out of? Some of the key nuances there, nothing jumps out as being a clear and obvious solution. So there's no silver bullet in this. While, say, option 4 maybe has your best return on investment at this point, you look at the residual risk on the right and you've still got a lot of people living on that flat area. So you haven't really managed your way out of that risk. Similarly, you can move, 6 and 7, you can move a lot of people out and you essentially solve the problem in terms of you eliminate risk. However, that's going to be enormously socially and economically disruptive. So again, it's just that balance of trade-offs. How did we get here? Basically, before we introduced this in a spatial dimension to people, where a logical stakeholder would say, what does this mean for my house? You immediately go down to that level. About 15 or 18 months ago, we put out a set of generic sort of adaptation approaches that you could use to manage risk, manage flooding in South Dunedin, and socialised people to these things deliberately, so they got a sense, okay, what are all the things we could do? There's a balance of things across that para framework: protect, accommodate, retreat, avoid. And okay, I get a sense it's going to be a mix. What we've basically done now is, if you think of these 16 things as ingredients, we've packaged them up, we'll put them in a cake, and each of the options represent, each of the futures represent a different mix of those adaptation, or a different cake, different set of ingredients. So that's that spectrum of fight and flight, and what we've done is illustrated that. What could it look like if you take those approaches? What could it look like at the end of the century? The next step in the process, we've just gone out and done a whole lot of community consultation for 6 or 8 weeks. The next step of the process is you hoover all that up, combine it with some more technical and economic analysis, and narrow that list of 7 down to, say, 2 or 3. And then we want to add some detail. So what are the key moves you might do in an infrastructure or a planning sense over the 25-year periods, maybe between now and the end of the century? Rinse and repeat, go out and do that again, and ultimately you narrow it down to some sort of preferred pathway. And this is just illustrative, but in this example, it might be that on balance, we think an infrastructure-heavy approach is appropriate for the first 25 years, transitioning to more of a mixed approach. So you might start planning for land use changes now, but they might not take effect for 25 years. For example, you start introducing green space, nature-based solutions, start pulling people out of the highest risk areas, and eventually you've transitioned to a point where either everyone has retreated from that lowest lying land, or you've raised the land, or you've transitioned that to some sort of different land use. Quite a big task, and this is just an illustration of kind of the current urban form in South Dunedin, and I've just picked option 6 because it's the example that kind of involves the most change, if you like. You think about how different the urban form is in that image on the right versus where we are today. There's an enormous amount of work that might need to go in. But in doing that, there's an enormous amount of activity, an enormous amount of opportunity, an enormous amount of sort of, revenue that could be generated, or activity that could be generated in that process. What we think needs to happen, really, if you think back to that earlier comment I made about, having 40 to 50 years before the worst of the onset of the physical hazards, we're probably in a state where we need to go through some sort of rapid and extensive change. In many ways, this is catching up. So how do you right-size or reconfigure the current urban form to better match this changing environment? We've probably ignored that environment, all those signals that we've got from the environment over the last sort of 30, 40, 50 years, and we're now left out of alignment, if you like. So there's a bit of catching up to do. And then, as emissions keep rising, as sea level keeps rising, we're probably in a state of constant change. So then you sort of need to recalibrate that and just keep going. And so that urban form, that urban regeneration or change will continue. There's probably a lot of things that are necessary for that to happen, and this is where we start thinking about what's the ecosystem or the environment that you'd need to occur for that to happen. Those first 3 points there I've just grouped, not necessarily because they're sequential, but because they're linked to central government. We do need a real push for data and information. I think there is obviously a need for some sort of standardisation of practice. We need some legislation. Nikki made a point around we can't have this flip-flopping with each political cycle. Climate change, these issues, these investments all transcend political cycles. So again, it doesn't really matter what the decision is. What's more important is that it holds. And then you might need central government support for speed and scale. The other bit is, those other 3 points really, you need to essentially keep the lights on for 50 years. So you can't have any of these dominoes falling around insurance or finance. You can't have councils stopping providing key services. Or we need to figure out a way, not where we say just enable growth, but how do you enable degrowth in an area where you might be servicing a community of 5,000 people today, but in 20 years' time you're going to be servicing half that number. What size pipe do you put in the ground now? And how do you make the economics of that stack up? They are the sorts of new challenges that I think we're facing. Ultimately, where we want to get to is we will have an adaptation master plan, I think, for South Dunedin by the end of next year. So that'll be that kind of final stage that'll map it out. What changes need to occur, when and where, over different periods. So that's your kind of 75-year plan. The key bit, obviously, now is implementation. How do you make that happen? How do you make this so it's not just something that sits on a shelf? And I think where we've ended up with that is that part of the reason for the time frame is we need to try and hit the end of next year so that this links into local government planning cycles, essentially. So what we want to do is flood basically not just the public system, but also the local government system with all of this knowledge, all this information, all this risk data and option data. So then all of my colleagues in Three Waters and planning and transport can then integrate that into their work plans, their strategies, their budgets for the coming 10 years. And you basically kick into implementation immediately from 1 July 2027. That probably looks like this. Essentially, council illustrating it in 3 implementation annexes. 1, what are the land use changes that are going to be required in South Dunedin? So that might be turning the screws on townhouse development in the flat that's currently occurring, something we hear often. You don't necessarily need to do that to drive that change. After we released these reports, 3 days later, we had one of the big townhouse developers in Dunedin out on the front page of the paper saying, we're not doing it anymore on the flat. We didn't compel them to do that, we didn't drive that, but they're obviously business, they've got commercial drivers, they'll see the risk and return there, and they've made a decision actively to look and develop elsewhere. That's one part of the picture. We want to discourage the wrong type of development in the wrong areas. But there's another side to that coin, which I'll talk about shortly. There's a whole lot of resilience infrastructure that we need to do, and some of that's about figuring out just how much we spend on that and what that looks like in terms of traditional or green infrastructure. But in any future for South Dunedin, we need an infrastructure solution, and that's going to be a key part of that. The third point there is probably the most interesting and exciting point of the whole thing, and this is where, when we started doing this process, South Dunedin is stuffed, right? The sky is falling on this place, and it's just a case of we dig in as long as we can, and then everyone needs to get out. If you flip that around and you say, okay, actually, no doubt this place has some challenges, and we've defined those in this process, but actually, if we need to change, is there an enormous opportunity that comes with change? Can we use climate change as a catalyst for basically an urban regeneration or urban redevelopment program? So if we need to build or change the urban form over the next 50 years, why can't we have better infrastructure? Why can't we have better housing? Why can't we have more green and blue space? Actually, that's going to make it a much nicer place to live. There might be some value created out of that. It might become more attractive. That becomes attractive for developers. Can we crowd in some private investment? And all of a sudden, you're into a completely different conversation with both technical colleagues, but also stakeholders that are directly affected. It's not just that my place is going to be wet. It's actually that the process of moving or undertaking this change might result in me being in a newer, warmer, drier home next to some much nicer sort of public amenities, and actually that's a better world than what I live in now. This is where it's kind of distilled down to kind of the essence of the program, really. It started off being about safer. How do you make it safer in a flooding sense? And where it's evolved to is not just safer, but how do you make it better as well? And that's been this kind of fundamental reshaping of the discussion. Where we think we're probably getting to now is, in a commercial sense, we get this master plan, you build some confidence in a range of partners by committing to that in a council 10-year plan. We're going to resource some infrastructure, we're going to create some green space, we're going to do some rezoning. And you've probably got a public heavy investment up front. And as you build momentum, build confidence, then you look to crowd in the, additional private finance over time. And ultimately, you want to just end up where you're kind of operating in this Goldilocks zone. If I got that, oh, I might have had it on a previous slide. Ultimately, you want to end up in a Goldilocks zone of how do you change and operate fast enough that you stay ahead of the onset of those hazards that I talked about, but not get ahead of your social license for change, not get out of your political permission space or your mandate, obviously work within your financial envelopes, and what does threading that needle look like? And ultimately, if we can hover in that space, there's no reason why we can't pull this off, because a lot of this, in essence, I think is not something necessarily new and fantastic. It's just kind of BAU from a slightly different perspective. And that's kind of the big takeaway. I don't know that we need to completely tear up the book on this. We just need to think a little differently and use the tools we've got a bit smarter. Cool, sorry. That's time. Thank you so much.